This is Australian Agenda.
Hello and welcome to Australian Agenda. I'm Peter Van Oslen. Well, we've got a big program for you. Shortly we'll be speaking to the leader of the Australian Greens, Bob Brown. And a little later in the program we'll be talking to the Shadow Attorney General, George Brandis, also here in the studio. And we'll be crossing to Rick Wallace, the Tokyo correspondent for the Australian newspaper in Japan at the moment. All of that coming up on Australian Agenda. Paul Kelly, welcome to the program. One of the issues during the week was some tension between Gillard and former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. What's your read on that?
This is now a very serious dispute between Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd over the no-fly zone in Libya, and it highlights the fragile personal relationship between the new Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister, now Foreign Minister. Kevin Rudd in particular was very concerned about a report in the Fairfax Press quoting an unnamed Gillard advisor saying that he, Rudd, was out of control. Rudd himself has made a statement to the weekend papers saying that the position he took in support of the no-fly zone was Australian government policy and that he'd been quite consistent on that. He also made very clear his displeasure at the out-of-control comment. I think the moral here, of course, is that during the critical time when Kevin Rudd was in the Middle East and Julia Gillard was in Washington, they didn't talk about this issue. They should have done that. I've got no doubt, looking at what they've both said, there was a difference of emphasis between the two leaders, between the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, in terms of the policy on the no-fly zone. And one of the critical things is their capacity to sort this out and work together.
The week started with a bad news poll for the Prime Minister, very good for our first guest, Bob Brown and the Greens. How do you see that for Julia Gillard? How much of a problem is it?
What's happened is that Julia Gillard's new climate change initiative has bombed out. The news poll last week showed the Labor primary vote at 30%. That is the worst primary vote for the Labor Party at the national level in the history of news poll. The winners in the short term from this situation in particular are the Greens, whose primary vote went up, and to a lesser extent the Coalition. One of the points here for Julia Gillard is that this is going to be a very, very hard sell for her when it comes to this new policy. There'll be pressure for her to back down. Frankly, I think that would be a mistake. While it's difficult, I think Gillard's got no real choice at this point in time but to press ahead. If she retreated, or if she fails to get the legislation through, it's obvious what the opposition leader, Tony Abbott, will say. He'll say that Gillard ought to either resign or call a general election immediately. Neither is a palatable option as far as Labor's concerned. So while it's hard for Gillard, I think she's got no choice but to press ahead with this policy.
Paul Kelly, thank you. And without further ado, we are joined here in the studio by the leader of the Australian Greens, as I mentioned earlier, Bob Brown. Thanks for your company.
Good morning, Peter. Good morning, Paul.
We'll get to the price on carbon in a moment, but first, these extraordinary scenes that we've seen from the earthquake and the tsunami in Japan. Attached to that has been the leaking of the nuclear reactor in Japan. Do you see this as further evidence why nuclear power is not the way to go?
Well, Peter, it is an appalling situation in Japan, and the death toll is mounting and going to be huge, and the disruption and the anguish for the Japanese people is just enormous. So it's good that Australia is acting quickly, along with many other countries, to come to Japan's aid. But yes, the nuclear power stations were always a worry when it came to earthquakes of this magnitude. We've seen overnight the destruction of one of the outer plant buildings. We're told there's not a meltdown, but there's now a removal of people from more than up to 20 kilometres from the region, and they're issuing iodine tablets, which are a hedge against thyroid cancer, but not the other impacts of radiation on people who imbibe it. We don't know yet what the outcome will be, but it is a pointer to the limits of human safeguards when it comes to dealing with dangerous nuclear plants in a fault zone like that.
Senator, in recent times, one of the arguments made by those supporting nuclear power is that the nuclear industry is essentially safe. and a lot of the alarmist and scare campaigns about the nuclear industry are in fact misplaced. Do you think this is a wake-up call? And what's your view about the extent to which what's going on with this nuclear power plant in Japan should prompt a further reassessment?
Well, it will prompt that assessment, and I hear the proponents of nuclear power saying already that this is going to set back their proposition that nuclear is safe for a long, long time to come. Wake-up call, you know, the Australian people don't want nuclear power. We know that from John Howard's proposal for up to 25 nuclear power stations back in the run to the 2007 election, and it was dropped 6 months out from the election. Why have very expensive nuclear power, which always needs massive taxpayer backing, when you can have safe, renewable energy, and in this country, which is blessed with an enormous potential for large-scale solar and other forms of renewable energy and energy efficiency. But this needs to be said about nuclear power, Paul. The proponents of nuclear power in Australia will know that if we were to go that direction, the region will follow suit. And that includes Indonesia, where there's proposals for 11 or 13 nuclear reactors in Java, which is in the so-called Ring of Fire in earthquake-prone areas. It's an unsafe technology. It's not just earthquakes. It's the potential for terrorisms. You can't have it in flight paths. It needs to be built next to big areas of population, energy use. It takes up a lot of water. It's enormously expensive, and we have much better alternatives, thank God. And Australia, I'm sure, is going to be taking those alternatives for a long, long time to come.
Dr Brown, the last time that we spoke was mid-last year, and you made some news by pointing out that Kevin Rudd hadn't taken a meeting with you for over a year, and that was despite the ETS legislation being put before the Parliament, which the Greens ultimately didn't support. Moving on, where we are today, it's quite a different Parliament. You know, you've got weekly or fortnightly meetings with the Prime Minister. Do you feel like you've gone from being the political outsider when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister to being a real political insider with some sway on the government now?
I've never felt like the Greens were outsiders. The people are voting for us in bigger numbers, and that's...
But you were treated that way by the major parties.
Oh, yeah, naturally, but not by the Australian people, who see us more and more as the insiders and the responsible future charters of better alternatives for Australia. But that said, yes, I wasn't having a good conversation there. Mind you, I backed Kevin Rudd's and Julia Gillard's no-fly zone proposal for Gaddafi in Libya, where, again, appalling events are unfolding as we sit here. And the world's attention is diverted by the disaster in Japan and the cruelty that's going on in Libya. We need to be taking real measures to help prevent much worse. Julia Gillard, I find a very good person. She sticks to her word.
Easier to deal with than Kevin Rudd.
Well, absolutely. I'm having more access, but that is because post-election there's a balance of power in both houses of Parliament, with the Greens involved in both. And if it were Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister, there would be access now. If it were Tony Abbott as Prime Minister and he turned down that option, it would be talks with him. And in fact, I met with him a fortnight ago because and the last piece of legislation that involved three-way power that I was involved with was my bill to stop junk food advertising in children's TV hours. We've got this obesity concern for the future in Australia, and it was Labor and Liberal that got together and blocked that bill.
But do you recognise politically, as it's not your problem, but do you recognise politically how difficult this is for the Prime Minister? It's good for the Greens, you're doing well, you're getting the access, you're able to move towards policy positions that you've advocated for a long time with that access in a minority government. But it is, at the same time, for Julia Gillard, as I say, not your problem, but it is creating political difficulties for her.
Yes, that's true. Mind you, I think the biggest political difficulties for the press gallery, which can't get their head around, for the first time in Australian history, minority government in both houses. That's what the people voted for. and I'm in Australian history, minority government in both houses. That's what the people voted for. And a Greens component, a third party, which has got a much more realistic set of policies to deal with Australia in the 21st century. But coming back to the Prime Minister, but I think she's up to it. She's getting a lot of criticism, but I think that she's... I don't agree, for example, with everything she's saying in the public arena, nor does she agree with me. But on a one-to-one basis, I find that she is direct, that she is trustworthy, and that we have a business-like relationship, which is what the people of Australia would want.
But if we just look at outcomes, Senator Brown, if we just look at outcomes, the polls make it quite clear that the Labor-Green alliance so far is working very much towards the interests of the Greens and working very much against the interests of the Labor Party in terms of results. What's your response to that?
I think that'll turn around. The big problem, Paul, and you were just talking about her need to stay true to the proposal for a carbon price. And Greg Combay, as her minister, is very ably putting that policy to the Australian people. But of course there is a committee working on this, a cabinet subcommittee, which is going to hopefully be able to report to the Australian people in July. And in the meantime, a bit of wallop being put in there by Tony Abbott, who has a much more expensive alternative, which will cost $30 billion over the next 10 years, which will cost the average household right across this country $720 per annum by 2020. And all the economists agree it is more expensive than what Gillard and the Greens are looking at. I think when this comes through and the Australian people get to see the reality of that position, he's expensive. He's going to take the money off the people and give it to the polluters. Julia Gillard's proposal will take the money off the polluters and give it to householders. That's the difference. I think there's going to be a big turnaround here. You wait and see. And I'll be interested to see the day come when Tony Abbott does debate this issue with the Prime Minister. I think he'll be on a hiding to nothing.
Well, one of the big decisions the Greens will have to take this year is what they do on the actual legislation on the carbon pricing bills when those bills come in. Now, how committed are you, as leader of the Greens, to try and ensure that this legislation gets through?
Well, very committed, but we don't have the legislation yet.
Sure.
And of course, the thing that happens before the legislation is the agreement. We've announced the framework for that agreement, and that's set, the Abbott great big tax, whereas I just said he's got a greater, bigger tax on the people in store as an alternative. It set them running, but they must be very, very worried about the outcome of this committee and the ability of both the government and the Greens to be able to successfully put that to an Australian... And just if I can, yesterday the Tea Party folk promoted by 2GB and the far right were out in force in Melbourne. 400 of them turned up to oppose this great big tax outside Julia Gillard's office. But down the road, Get Up got 8,000 people out in support of a carbon price. The Australian people are not mugs. They are intelligent and they want to make a secure future for this nation. And I think Tony Abbott, he's got the whistle going at the moment, but I don't think there's any substance to it. And when he gets to the substance, he's going to be in trouble. If we can just focus
not on Tony Abbott but on the Greens, are you optimistic? Are you optimistic that this legislation will pass later this year?
Yes, I am.
You are?
Yes, I am, Paul. That's why we're working so hard on it. Christine Milne and I and Adam Bant, our representative from Melbourne, have been working hard on this in the committee. With the independents are very important to this, and they are injecting a point of view which is very essential, particularly representing rural interests. I think it's a very mature way to be proceeding on probably the biggest issue economically, environmentally and security-wise for this nation's future.
Now, if we can just look at compensation. Are you prepared to compensate households to a very considerable extent for most of the price impact?
Yes, and
you are.
Yes, absolutely. And I see Rio Tinto whinging about a potential 1% impost after it made $14.5 billion, most of which it's exported out of this country, as a big polluter. And you know, they're going to be in town complaining that the money shouldn't be going to householders, it should be going to them while they export it out of this country. We are on the side of the householders, and I will come back to Tony Abbott. He is on the side of the polluters. You see, that's the difference. Where we're going, where the Gillard government is going, is with the average Australian householder to make sure they are protected from power price rises which will come out of a carbon price. But the big polluters are in town, and they've got Tony Abbott and this Tea Party phenomenon aboard, and they want to pull the rug from under that proposal to make sure the average Australian is looked after. Well, we're with the Gillard government's philosophy on this, and it remains to be seen how effective. I am aware that the same mob were in Canberra on the mining tax and got $100 billion shelter over the next 10 years. This is Rio Tinto and Co. They've taken $10 billion out of each average budget in the next 10 years for schools, hospitals, transport and so on, out of the average Australian's well-being to feather their own massive profits.
Well, that's a pretty big signal you've just sent to the Gillard government. You're effectively saying that the Greens are not going to wear large-scale support for these sections of industry.
We have said that we will ensure that trade-exposed industries are looked after insofar as their exposure is to their detriment. Let's be very clear about that. It isn't either or. But the emphasis we're giving is to looking after the average Australian and their future and their ability to make ends meet. The big corporations need to be heeded, but they don't need to be a winner-takes-all, as they effectively were with the minerals tax. That's you know, if that happens, it is schools, hospitals, the potential for high-speed rail in this country, a sovereign wealth tax that the Greens are looking for. They're pulling the rug from under that, and we are responsibly charting a much better economic outcome for the people of Australia in our parliamentary work.
But how pragmatic are you prepared to be on this, understanding that the government will probably want to protect its right flank but still get the legislation through? If Gillard doesn't get this legislation through, she's effectively finished as Prime Minister. I think most of us would think. Now, how pragmatic are you prepared to be? Government ministers have said that they don't think that the ultimate package here will be that different to the package that the Greens rejected when the ETS came up under Kevin Rudd. Is it partly different because there's more pragmatism now, you've got more access, you've got a dialogue with the Prime Minister to be more accommodating rather than standing purely on principle and rejecting it?
Well, you know, I'm very optimistic about it. We are pragmatic. We recognise that we got 11, 13, 15% of the vote. We are not the government, but we are there to help the government come to a good outcome for Australia. It isn't winner takes all in this era of politics, not in this country or elsewhere around the world. We have a plurality of views feeding into our democracy. It's very healthy. But what will happen here is we will get greener, a more economically rational, if you believe in social justice legislation coming out of this. And I'm very mindful in my talks with the Prime Minister, I'm sure she is in reverse, that we do need to come to a consensus, to an agreement. The very nature of this process is to come to an agreement and then put it to Parliament. So we've got, you know, the Tony Abbott mob out there yelling and screaming on behalf of the big corporation, on behalf of the polluters. Fine. We are not being deterred from our path, our trajectory to come to an agreement which is going to get the consensus of the Australian people who want action on climate change.
What sort of carbon price do you want? I mean, there's been talk of a carbon price, $20, $25 a tonne. Is that the sort of price that you'd be looking at?
Paul,
You must have a minimum.
Nice try, but I'm in a cabinet subcommittee that's working on the best carbon price that we can get in the interest of all players by July. I have seen. I have talked to one corporation which thinks that they're planning for a future of a $40 carbon price. I have talked to one corporation which thinks that they're planning for a future of a $40 carbon price. There are higher prices elsewhere in the world and there are lower prices. What we want is an Australian price that's right for this country. And it's very, very important. We're very aware of that, and we are going to get the best carbon price. But whatever it is, be able to look after householders. And I repeat this because it's important. Whereas Tony Abbott's price, $30 billion over the next 3 years, will be taken off taxpayers and effectively featherbed the polluters. That's the difference.
That sort of sounds as though you'll be reasonably flexible on the carbon price, is that right?
We've gone into these talks with flexibility. That is important. We haven't gone in with a dictate. We recognise that the Australian people want us to be conversing with the independents, who are very important here, and the government, which ultimately has to bring the legislation into the parliament. And I can tell you, we've got enormous outreach of advice in the field of science, economics, business, community organisations. This is a very big operation, but it's got outreach into the Australian community like no previous process. And I think it will be effective.
Just on the political stakes involved here, given what happened to Kevin Rudd, do you accept that if Julia Gillard can't get this legislation through the Parliament, she's effectively finished as Prime Minister?
Oh, that's so negative. I think she's got a great future as a Prime Minister. And,
with or without this legislation?
No, I think she's... I think that she's taken on a huge political task here, but it's the right one for the country, and I think she'll be rewarded for it.
Dr Brown, on another issue with the time we've got left, your plans to curtail the Prime Minister's ability to curtail territory legislation, to put it back in the hands of the Federal Parliament as to whether or not it can do that, or to put it in the hands of the Federal Parliament. Is this about territory rights primarily, or is it about the issues on which we could see territory legislation not be overruled by a Prime Minister, things like gay marriage, euthanasia and so forth?
Shanahan has got it wrong, notwithstanding in the Australian. It is about territory rights. I first introduced this bill back in 2006, but long before that I was aware that the territories were being shortchanged because a minister could override any law that went through the parliaments. I think it was first set up that way when the Northern Territory got self-governance, so that no future government there could block uranium exports. The federal government didn't want that happening. It was a much bigger issue in the 70s than it is now. And it is democratically right that those elected representatives in the parliaments in Darwin and in the ACT should be able to pass legislation, much like the states. Section 122 of the Constitution says there will always be a federal parliamentary override. We can't change that. But the idea that a minister can override some legislation that those parliaments have been put through is quite wrong. By the way, this legislation does not overturn the Andrews Bill back in 1997, where the federal parliament overrode the Northern Territory's ability to legislate for euthanasia.
But if we could just ask you about the Andrews Bill, because you foreshadowed an earlier bill relating to territory powers and relating to euthanasia, which would enable the territory parliaments to legislate again for euthanasia if they so desired. What is the current status of that bill, and are you determined to press ahead with it?
Paul, it's in its second reading debate in the Senate, but it became very clear that nearly everybody wanted to talk on it. So it requires, I asked Kevin Rudd about this and didn't get anywhere, and I'm hoping I'll have more luck with the Gillard government, that in government business, maybe later this year, we'll be able to bring it on for a full debate, as the Howard government allowed a private member's bill to have a full debate on overriding the Northern Territory back in 96-97. So that awaits a full debate further down the line. It can't be done in private members' time because there simply isn't time.
So you are committed to pressing ahead with that bill?
I am, because I think the territories ought to have their right to legislate on the issue of euthanasia returned. And remember, all the polls since the 80s have shown that 80% of Australians support such legislation.
Do you think the federal parliament will legislate this term for same-sex marriage?
Well, that is in the hands of both the Labor Party and the Coalition, who are somewhere back last century, and again are way behind majority public opinion in Australia. They should do. Senator Hanson-Young has moved legislation to overturn that discrimination under the marriage laws, but that awaits one of the bigger parties who currently have got together to institutionalise discrimination against people who want to have marriage on the basis that they're in a same-sex relationship. The Australian people have moved on, are very accepting of that. The body politic is still back in a time warp, influenced by some very, very powerful far-right people who don't want to see that change.
Bob Brown, we've kept you here longer than we'd promised to. We appreciate your patience with us. One quick question before we let you go. You're in New South Wales because you're here to launch the Greens campaign for the state election. That's one of the things you've got to get to today. Do you want to hazard a guess for us at how you think the Greens are going to go?
Well, I think Jamie Parker in Balmain and Fiona Byrne in Marrickville are doing very well. I've been in those electorates. I'm going back to Balmain Town Hall today for the launch of the Greens. They've got a great team in the upper house. It's very, very important that people recognise that the Greens are a roll gold alternative in an upper house. Otherwise, we might have the Howard situation where a future Farrell coalition government here would have control of both houses. And bang goes then the safety of national parks and a lot of other things, sale of public assets and so on. I think it's a very exciting time for New South Wales voters. The Greens are the powerful and responsible alternative, and I'm looking forward to that launch today. I think a lot more needs to be thought about as far as the voters of New South Wales. They've got two largely failed older parties. And again, the Greens are offering an alternative. And it will be very, very important in the next period of Parliament that they have a cogent, responsible and environmentally sound alternative on the floor of the lower house in Macquarie Street, where, you know, we're seeing now with the new Liberal government in Victoria, for example, cattle back into the Alpine National Parks. I've heard nothing about that from Mr O'Farrell in New South Wales. It's a question I'll be asking today. What's going to happen to the new River Redgum National Park on the Murray? Liberals committed in the parliamentary debate to fighting against that all the way down the line. Well, there's a few questions that need to be put on the table here before people get to the ballot box in a fortnight. And of course, naturally, I'll be advising anybody who's unsure to vote for the Greens. That's the absolute surety for voters who are worried in New South Wales. All right, Bob Brown, thank you for your company on Australian Agenda. We appreciate it. Thank you both. When we come back from the break, we will be talking directly to the Australian's Tokyo correspondent, Rick Wallace, to see what's the latest out of Japan. See you shortly.